Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. A very warm welcome to this Monday, 23rd January 2023 Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam discussion. Today we are reading from Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, Canto 2, entitled The Cosmic Manifestation, Chapter 6, Text 7. Before we discuss on this verse, let's sing Jai Radha Madhava. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari, Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari, Yashodanandana Prajajana Ranjana, Yashodanandana Prajajana Ranjana, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari, Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari, Yashodanandana Rajajana Ranjana, Yashodanandana Rajajana Ranjana, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari, Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari, Yashodanandana Rajajana Ranjana, Yashodanandana Rajajana Ranjana, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Jai Radha Govinda Radha Govinda Radha Govinda Shri Radhe, Jai Radha Govinda Radha Govinda Radha Govinda Shri Radhe, Jai Nitai Sachinandana Gaura Hari, Nitai Sachinandana Gaura Hari, Jaya Nitai Sachinandana Gaura Hari, Nitai Sachinandana Gaura Hari, Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivrajakacarya Ashtotra Sahita Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Shri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki jai. अनंत कोटि वैष्णव वृंद की जय. नामाचार्य श्री हरिदास ठाकुर की जय. प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद की जय. श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोप गोपीनाथ श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरि गोवर्धन की जय. वृंदावन धाम की जय. मथुरा धाम की जय. मायापुर धाम की जय. जगन्नाथपुरी धाम की जय. गंगा माई की जय. यमुना माई की जय. तुलसी देवी की जय. भक्ति देवी की जय. सामवेद भक्त वृंद की जय. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Namaham Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine. Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Deshatarine. Sarvam Shri Krishnarpanamastu Krishne Matirastu. Hare Krishna. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 6, Text 7. Vikramo bhuvaḥ svaś, kṣemasya śaraṇasya ca, sarva-kāma-varasyāpi, hareś āspadam. Vikramo bhuvaḥ svaś, kṣemasya śaraṇasya ca, sarva-kāma-varasyāpi, hareś āspadam. Vikramo bhuvaḥ svaś, kṣemasya śaraṇasya ca, sarva-kāma-varasyāpi, hareś āspadam. Word by word. Vikramaha, forward steps. Bhuvaḥ, of the lower and upper planets. Svaha, as well as of heaven. Cha, also. Kṣemasya, of protection of all that we have. śaraṇasya, of fearlessness. Cha, also. Sarva-kāma, all that we need. Varasya, of all benedictions. Api, exactly. Hare, of the Lord. caraṇa, the lotus feet. Āspadam, shelter. Translation. Thus, the forward steps of the Lord are the shelter for the upper, lower, and heavenly planets, as well as for all that we need. His lotus feet serve as protection from all kinds of fear. Purport by His Divine Grace Shri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki jai. For absolute protection from all sorts of fear, as well as for all our needs of life, we must take shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord. Not only in this planet, but also in all the upper, lower, and heavenly planets. This absolute dependence on the lotus feet of the Lord is called pure devotional service. And it is directly hinted at within this passage. No one should have any kind of doubt in this matter, nor should one be inclined to seek the help of any other demigods, because all of them are dependent on Him only. Everyone, except the Lord Himself, is dependent on the mercy of the Lord. Even the all-pervading super soul is also dependent on the supreme aspect of Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. Before we discuss on this verse, let us offer some prayers. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Nama Shreshtham Manamapi Shachiputram Matra Swarupam Rupam Tasyagrajam Nurupurim Maturim Goshthavati Radha Kundam Girivaram Maho Radhika Madhavasham Prapto Yasya Pratita Kripaya Shri Gurum Tam Natosmi Vandeham Shri Gurum Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha Adadandastranam Dante Idam Yachaha Punaha Punaha Shriman Rupa Padambhojam Dhulisyam Janma Janmani He Krishna Karuna Sindho Deenabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vancha Kalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 6, Text 7. Vikramo bhūr bhuvaḥ kṣemasya śaraṇasya cha sarva-kāma-varasyāpi hareś āspadam. Thus, the forward steps of the Lord are the shelter for the upper, lower, and heavenly planets, as well as for all that we need. His lotus feet serve as protection from all kinds of fear. So we see in this verse how the wonderful glorification of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is done. We'll try and understand the 4 lines in this verse. The first line is vikramo bhūr bhuvaḥ svaś. And the translation or the synonyms here is the forward steps of the lower and upper planets as well as the heaven also. So we can understand that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is present everywhere. This is what is meant by the first line of this verse, vikramo bhūr bhuvaḥ svaś. And when we hear the bhūr bhuvaḥ sva, we are also reminded of the Gayatri mantra. The Gayatri mantra says, bhūr bhuvaḥ svaha tatsavitur varenyam bhargo devasya dhimahi dhiyo yunah prachodayat. It starts with Om. Om iti aksharam mantram ek vyahran ma manusparan yet tyajati sa teham yati nasti atra samshaya. So Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita that someone who says the mantra, the pranava mantra, Om, and at the same time remembers the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in that situation, if someone gives up the body, such a person goes back home, back to Godhead, to the original position of all the living entities. So in the Gayatri mantra, it is the Om bhūr bhuvaḥ svaha. And that those words are used in the first line of this verse. Vikramo bhūr bhuvaḥ svaś. Bhūr bhuvaḥ svaha tat savitur varenyam bhargo devasya dhimahi dhiyo yunah prachodayat. That is the mantra generally in the Hindu kind of lifestyle. But actually in the Vedic culture itself, it is the mantra which denotes the worshipping of the sun god. So the devotee is praying to the sun god and saying that, please illuminate my intelligence through your glorious brightness. But we understand Yat chakshuresha savita sakala grahanam raja samasta suramurti rashesha teja yasyagnyaya brahmati sambrita kala chakro Govinda purusham damaham bhajami. Yeah, so this is mentioned in Brahma Samhita about how this is the eyes of the Lord, the sun and the moon. Yat chakshuresha savita sakala grahana. So that savita word is used. Tat savitur varenyam. So in that Brahma Samhita it is Yat chakshuresha savita sakala grahana. So this sun god is considered to be the eyes for all the planets. Because of the brightness of the sun god, everything is seen. The light coming from the sun god. So this is Yat chakshuresha savita sakala grahana raja samasta suramurti rashesha teja. So the brightness of the sun is ashesha teja. It's unlimited. When we see the brightness spreading across the whole planetary systems, so it is ashesha teja. That brightness is just it just encapsulates wherever it goes. Yasyagnyaya brahmati sambrita kala chakro Govinda purusham tamaham bhajami. Under whose direction the sun is moving on in the chariot. So this is the wonderful situation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And we see here in this bhūr bhuvaḥ svaś, the presence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is there everywhere. It does not matter whether it's the lower planetary system. It does not matter whether it's middle planetary system. It does not matter whether it's a higher planetary system. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is present everywhere. Ekopi asau rachaitam jagadanda kotim yat shaktirasti jagadanda taya yadanta andantarastham paramanu chayantarastham Govinda purusham damaham bhajami. So that particular verse in Brahma Samhita is saying that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is one, but he has created unlimited universes. Jagadanda kotim. Ekopi asau rachaitam jagadanda yat shakti asti jagadanda taya yadanta andantarastham paramanu chayantarastham. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead, when the universe gets created, he is present as the maintainer of the universe, and then he is also present in the nucleus, each and every nucleus across the whole universe. So this is the transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is present everywhere. Ito narsimo, parato narsimo, bahir narsimo, hridaye narsimo. Narsimha madhim sharanam prapadye. As it is said by Prahlad Maharaj. So we see this wonderful pastime in the Vedas, in the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, where Prahlad Maharaj is born as the son of Hiranyakashipu and Kayadhu. And Prahlad Maharaj, because within the womb of his mother, he got the instructions of Narada Muni, the pure devotee of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. When Prahlad Maharaj was born, he was born a pure devotee of the Lord. So even within the womb of his mother, he was getting instructions from pure devotee Sri Narada Muni. And when he was born a pure devotee. We see in that history in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam how much attached Sri Prahlad Maharaj was towards the service of the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Sri Prahlad Maharaj gave this instruction about the 9 kinds of devotional service that one can engage in. Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnum, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atmanivedanam, Iti Pumsarpida Vishnu Bhakti Chet Navalakshana, Kriyeta Bhagavati Adhatan Manye Aditam Uttamam. So this is what Srila Prahlad Maharaj says. He says that There are 9 kinds of devotional service, starting with hearing, Shravanam. So when we are hearing, and when the hearing becomes strong and one pointed concentration, with one pointed concentration, when the hearing is that strong, then the transcendental sound vibrations are absorbed within. And then we can have kirtanam. We can talk about the Lord. When we hear about the Lord, then we can talk about the Lord. It is in the technology arena, there is a concept called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So whatever is the input, the same would be the output. So if the input is, and where is the input coming from? The input is coming from our sense organs. The ears are hearing, so that is the input. The eyes are seeing, that is another input. The tongue is tasting, another input. The breath is taking the different kinds of aromas that are there. That is another input. The skin is touching. That is another input. So we have all these different kinds of inputs. And depending on what input we are giving, our output will also be the same. So if the input is Shrotavyadini Rajendra Nanam Santi Sahasrasa Apashyatam Atmatattvam Graheshu Grahamedinam. If the input is hearing everything except Krishna consciousness, except about Krishna, talks of Krishna and his pure devotees, then the output will also be, unfortunately, the same. So if Shravanam is Nranam Santi Sahasrasa Apashyatam Atmatattvam. So when we are in the material state of mind, whatever is matter gets more prominence rather than spirit. So in that material state of mind, one is not inclined to hear about the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that is why Srila Shukadeva Goswami says to Parikshit Maharaj that when one does not see the Atma Tattva, what is Atma Tattvam? Atma Tattva means one's original constitutional position as eternal part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, Mama eva amsha, jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana, manha shashtani indriyani prakriti sthani karshati. So Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita that all the living entities in this whole universe, and it does not matter where the living entity is present. The living entity could be in the heavenly planet, Brahma Bhuvanal Loka. So the living entity could be in the Brahma Loka. Even the living entity can be in the spiritual world. It does not matter where the living entity is. The main attraction for the living entity is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. And they are always linked with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Krishna says, Mama eva amsha. Certainly, all the living entities are my eternal part and parcels, Jiva Bhuta Sanātana. Then why is it that the living entities are struggling in this material world? Manaha Shashtani Indriyani. When there is identification with the mind and the 5 senses. And mind is called as a 6th sense in that verse by Sri Krishna. So when the living entity is coming under the influence of the mind and the 5 senses, which are engrossed in matter, then there is struggle in the material universe. So what do we mean by being engrossed in matter? When we say being engrossed in matter, it means that we consider the matter as all in all. We consider the gratification that we are getting from the matter as all in all. But what is the gratification from matter? It is the external gratification. So something that is not in the mind. So in the mind, if someone associates everything with Krishna, then the mind is Krishna consciousness, in total Krishna consciousness. But if one is looking at all these different material things and enjoying it on the basis that this is for my enjoyment. And one is just getting indulged in that sense gratification. Then one is in a forgetful state of mind. So when one is in a forgetful state of mind, one gets entangled in the cycle of birth and death. That is the so there is this beautiful verse in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, bhayam dvitiya bhiniveshata syat ishad apetasya viparyo asmriti. So that is asmriti, the forgetfulness. When one thinks that there is something other than Krishna anywhere, that's when the fear starts. Bhayam dvitiya bhiniveshata syat. So actually everywhere, like as we said, ito narsimo parato narsimo yato yato yami tato narsimo bahir narsimo hriday narsimo narsimham adim sharanam prapati. So as it is mentioned in that Narsimha Pranama mantra, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is present everywhere. And that was a conviction of Prahlad Maharaj, the pure devotee of Sri Krishna, who talked about this 9 kinds of devotional service. And that's why we were kind of talking about hearing and chanting about the Lord. And when we were talking about hearing and chanting, we talked about the concept of garbage in, garbage out that is there in technology. So whatever is the input, the same output will come. So if the Shravanam is something that is not related to the Lord, there is a chance that Kirtanam will also be something that is not related to the Lord. There is a lot of chance, or there is a high probability. So when there is no Shravanam of the Lord, no Kirtanam of the Lord, then there is no Smaranam of the Lord. There is no remembrance. Then there is no Pada Sevanam. Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Pada Sevanam. Pada Sevanam is the serving the lotus feet of the Lord. Then there is no Archanam, which is offering the flowers to the Lord. No Vandanam, no offering of prayers to the Lord. Dasyam, Sakhyam, Atmanivedanam, no servitude of the Lord, no friendship of the Lord, and no surrender to the Lord. So it's all dependent on what our mind is thinking about. So mana eva manushyanam karanam moksha bandhane bandhaya vishaya sangha mokshaya nirvishayam mana. It is mentioned in the scriptures that the mind itself is a cause of liberation and bondage for a living entity. So bandhaya vishaya sangha. When the mind is attached to the sense objects, the mind is conditioned by those sense objects. Mokshaya nirvishayam mana. When the mind is detached from the sense objects, the mind is in a liberated state. So how is this detachment from the sense object? Param drishtva nivartate. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehina rasavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, that the living entity, because the living entity is in a conditioned state of existence with a material mind and material body and material intelligence, one might try to forcefully separate oneself from the material contact. Rasavarjam rasopyasya. But still there is this, the material mind and material senses are going to the material objects. It kind of naturally happening in the material world. So how does one come out of that? Param drishtva nivartate. When one gets a higher taste. So sukham atyantikam yattad buddhigrahyam atindriyam veti yatrana chaivayam stitas chalati tatvata. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, that when the living entity understands one's constitutional position as an eternal part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one is experiencing a happiness which is totally outside the material realm. That happiness is independent of the sense coming in touch with the sense objects. That is sukham atyantikam yattat. It is a happiness which is atyantika. And it is buddhi grahyam atindriyam. So it surpasses all the so-called happiness and distress coming from the sense coming in touch with the sense objects. It surpasses that. It transcends it. So that's why atyantikam. It is transcendental bliss. Then sthithas chalati tattvata. Then one is situated in the experience of the real truth, tattvata. Janma karmam cha me divyam evam yo veti tattvata. Tyaktva deham punarjanmam naiti mameti, so Arjuna. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, one has to understand that Krishna's birth and Krishna's activities are all divine. It's transcendental to the material nature. So when we hear this transcendental activities of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and also his unalloyed devotees, because his unalloyed devotees are constantly in touch with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in that sense, they are fully transcendental and spiritual. And therefore, when we're discussing about the unalloyed pure devotees of Krishna, it is the outcome of that is actually like discussing about Krishna himself. And therefore, Krishna actually says, Yame bhakta janapartha nime bhakta te janaha mad bhaktanam chaye bhakta teme bhakta tumo mata. So Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita that, not in Bhagavad Gita, it's in the Adi Purana. He says that the devotees who are my devotees are not actually my devotees. The devotee of my devotee is actually my devotee. Mad bhaktanam chaye bhakta. So this is the transcendental position of the involvement in devotional service of the Lord. Mad janma phalamidam madhukaita vare mad prarthaniya mad anugrata esha eva tvad bhritya bhritya paricharaka bhritya bhritya bhrityasya bhritya iti mam smara lokanatha. As it is said by Kulashekara Alvar, he actually prays to Krishna. He says that this is the outcome of my birth will be really auspicious, O Lord. Mad janma phalamidam madhukaita bare mad prarthaniya mad anugrata esha eva. And my only prayer and my only benediction from you, O Lord, is that what I want is, let me become the bhritya bhritya paricharaka bhritya bhritya bhrityasya bhritya. So that is 7 times. 7 times down the line, let me become this servant of the 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 servant of your pure devotee. So it is the transcendental position where so this is vitaraga bhaya krodha manmaya mamupashrita bahavo jnana tapasa puta mad bhavam agata. So Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita that there are many people who have gone back home, back to Godhead. So Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, vitaraga bhaya krodha. So if someone has given up the raga, bhaya and krodha, so that is the attachment to the material things. Bhaya is fear and krodha is anger. So when without that, when one has given up that, man maya mamupashrita. The second line Krishna says that the mind is fully absorbed in the Lord and one is totally surrendered onto the Lord. So when the mind is totally absorbed in the Lord and when one is totally surrendered onto the Lord, then one is in a state of giving up attachment, fear, and anger. Vitaraga bhaya krodha manmaya mamupashrita bahavo jnana tapasa puta mad bhavam agata. So Krishna mentions that many great souls who are totally absorbed in me and totally surrendered onto me, giving up attachment, fear, and anger, have come back home, back to Godhead, to me. Mad bhavam agata. So this is and that's how this evam parampara praptam mimam rajarshayo vidu happens. That's how this parampara system, this succession, the translation of the transcendental knowledge, the transmission of the transcendental knowledge from generation to generation is happening. Evam parampara praptam imam rajarshayo vidu sakalini hamata yogo nashta parantapa. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, this transcendental knowledge has to be acquired in disciplic succession. And if the disciplic succession is broken, then the transcendental transmission of the transcendental knowledge, sakalini hamata yogo nashta parantapa, unfortunately gets destroyed. Therefore, it is extremely important to maintain that transmission of the transcendental knowledge from generation to generation. So here we see vikramo, bhūr, bhuvaḥ, svaś. So we have talked about the bhūr, bhuvaḥ, sva, that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is present everywhere, even the lower planetary system, in the middle planetary system, and in the upper planetary system, everywhere. Vikramo, bhūr, bhuvaḥ, svaś, kṣemasya, śaraṇasya. And that the second line is beautifully mentioned there, that one has to take sharanam prapadye. So one has to take the shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Krishna Krishna Mahabhavo Bhaktanam Abhayankara Tvameko Dahyamananam Apavargosi Samsrite. So this is mentioned in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. The Supreme Personality of Godhead grants fearlessness to his pure unalloyed devotees. Krishna Krishna Mahabhavo Bhaktanam Abhayankara Tvameko Dahyamananam Apavargosi Samsrite. So it is mentioned in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, grants fearlessness. How does one become fearless? When one understands one's constitutional position as an eternal part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because the biggest fear is the fear of death. That is the greatest fear the living entity has. So even in the yoga sutras, there are five. It says about the five difficulties or five challenges that the living entity has, and the last is abhinivesha. So there is avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. So it starts with ignorance. So what is the ignorance? The ignorance of our eternal position as an eternal part and parcel of the Lord. So when we are ignorant of that, then there is this thinking that I am this body. So that is the false ego, which is asmita. So when I have this false ego, when I associate myself with the false ego, I have raga and dvesha. So raga is I'm attached to the things that I like, which is based on the impressions that I had since time immemorial. I've been taking birth after birth after birth, and the subtle body is storing all the different likes and dislikes that I have since time immemorial. So there is raga. So the likes are raga and the dislikes are dvesha. So vitaraga bhaya krodha, as we said. And then there is abhinivesha. Abhinivesha is the fear of death. So therefore we talk about that prayer. Bhayam dutiya abhinivesha dhasyat. So when we think that there is something other than the Lord, then there is fear. But if we know that everything is Lord and is energy, where is the fear? The matter is Lord's inferior energy, and the spirit is Lord's superior energy. And ekadesha stita sagnya jyotsna vistarini yatha parasya brahmanak shaktir tathedam akhilam jagat. So it is mentioned in the Vedas that just like the fire is at one place, but it distributes its heat and light everywhere. Similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is present. Goloka eva nivasati akhilatma bhuta. Govinda madipurusham tamaham vajami. Ekopi asau rachaitam jagadanda koti. So this is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Ananda chinmaya rasa pratibhavit abhis tabirya eva nijarupataya kalabhi. Goloka eva nivasati akhilatma bhuto. Govinda madipurusham tamaham vajami. So Ananda chinmaya rasa pratibhavit abhis. This is the Supreme Personality of Godhead who is fully blissful and fully conscious. Ananda chinmaya rasa tabhirya eva nijarupataya kalabhi. So all the living entities are eternal part and parcel of the Lord, and internally they have this Ananda Chinmaya potency, just like the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Ishvara Parama Krishna Sachidananda Vigraha Anadir Adir Govinda sarva-kāma-varasyāpi, as it is mentioned in Brahma Samhita, The Supreme Personality of Godhead is Sri Krishna. And what is his composition? He is Sat Chit Ananda Vigraha. He is an embodiment of truth, eternality, and bliss. Consciousness, eternal consciousness, existence. Satchidananda Vigraha, Anadir Adir Govinda. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself does not have any beginning, Anadi, but he is the beginning of everything, Adi. And he is called Govinda, one who gives pleasure to the senses and to the cows. This is a transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Go means cows, and Go also means senses. And Vinda, Govinda, that is the one who gives the pleasure to the cows and the senses. So this is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. He gives the pleasure to the senses. So whatever so-called happiness that we get from the senses, it is temporary. But the real happiness, the real pleasure to the senses comes when one gets in touch with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Yena tena prakarena mana krishne niveshet sarve vidhi nishedasyo retayor eva kinkara. So this is mentioned by Srila Rupa Goswami. It is said that he says that some way or the other fix the mind on Krishna. Yena tena prakarena sarve vidhi nishedasyo retayor eva kinkara. And then he continues that all the rules and regulations is subservient to this main rule. And what is this main rule? Manaha Krishne niveshayet. Some way or the other, fix the mind on Krishna. So what happens when the mind is fixed on Krishna? One becomes transcendental to all this material attachments and detachments. So this attachment and aversions. So all this is it is temporary. The real so as Krishna says, Maya sakta mana partha yogam yunjam madashrayam asamsham samagram mam yatha jñāsyasi tat shruṇu. So Krishna says that Mai asakta mana. So the mind has to be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. Then one can do the yogam yunjam madashrayam. So this śaraṇasya, we were in the second line now, kṣemasya śaraṇasya cha. So this śaraṇasya is possible when the mind is attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When the mind is attached, the mind is always remembering the transcendental divine pastimes of the Lord. And in that remembrance, one is outside the purviews of this material consciousness. One is in a totally transcendental situation. So this is the transcendental potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. So then we come to the next line of this verse, sarva-kāma-varasyāpi. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead is actually providing everything that is needed by the living entity. He is the this is akama sarva-kāma-va moksha-kāma udharadhi tivrena bhakti yogena yajeta purusham param. So it is mentioned in the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam that if one does not have any desires, akama, or one has unlimited desires, sarva-kāma-va, or one has a desire for liberation, moksha-kāma, udharadhi, tivrena bhakti yogena. So in that verse, it is said that one has to engage in the loving devotional service of Krishna with full intensity, with full devotion, with full surrender. Yajeta Purusham Param, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. So if one does not have any desires, or if one has thousands of desires, or one has a desire for liberation, whatever be the case, akama sarva-kāma-va moksha-kāma udharadhi tivrena bhakti yogena yajeta purusham param. One has to render loving devotional service to the Lord with full intensity, full devotion, full emotion, full surrender. So this is the transcendental position of being involved in the devotional service of the Lord. Sarva-kāma-varasyāpi. The Supreme Personality of Godhead says that bhuteshu kaunteya murtaya sambhavantiya tasam brahma mahadyonir aham bija pradapita. So Krishna mentions that sarva yonishu kaunteya murtaya sambhavantiya. So all the living entities in this whole universe, the material nature is this mother, and I am the seed giving father, bija pradapita. So we can understand that the supreme, if we look at a family, the parents, the father and the mother, look after their children. So this is a kind of natural predisposition of a parent, that they want to look after their children. What to speak of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who himself is saying that he is a seed-giving father for all the living entities. So how compassionate he would be to his offsprings. So Krishna says that this is the material nature is the mother, and I am the seed-giving father. So this is a transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shri Krishna. Sarva-kāma-varasyāpi. So he is, so eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman. This is the nityo nityanam chetanas chetananam eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman. So Srila Prabhupada mentions many times in lots of his conversations, lectures about this particular verse from the Vedas. So he explains how Krishna is the supreme eternal among all the eternals. Nityo nityanam. So all the living entities are part and parcels of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and therefore they are all eternal as well. But the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the supreme eternal. Nityo nityanam. Chetanas chetananam. The supreme consciousness among all the consciousness that is existing. And then eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman. So Krishna is one, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but he is providing for all the unlimited living entities. This is a transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Bhoktaram yagya tapasam sarva-loka maheshwaram suhridam sarva-bhutanam yatva mam shantim uchiti. So when one understands that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is providing, irrespective of what the living entity is, that is a transcendental position to be. So that is sarva-kāma-varasyāpi. And then we come to the last line of this verse, which is hareś caraṇa āspadam. Hare, the Lord, caraṇa, the lotus feet, āspadam, shelter. So this is the goal of Vedaisya sarvair ahmeva vedyam vedanta krit vedanta vedeva chaham. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, that of everything in the Vedas, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shri Krishna, is to be known. And in the form of Veda Vyasa, the literary incarnation of the Lord, Vedanta Krit Vedanta Vedeva Chaham. So Krishna has compiled all the Vedas, and he is the actual knower of the Vedas. So this is the transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in that experience, one can take shelter at the lotus feet of the Lord. So as we were saying in the beginning, the fear is happening because one is thinking that there is something other than Krishna. So there is nothing everywhere. And then that's why we talked about the Narasimha Pranam mantra. Ito Narsimo, Parato Narsimo, Yato Yato Yami Tato Narsimo. And the conviction of Prahlad Maharaj that the Lord is present everywhere. And so Hiranyakashipu asks Prahlad Maharaj then, if the Lord is everywhere, then is he in this pillar also? So Prahlad Maharaj says, of course, yes. If he's everywhere, then he'll be in the pillar also. And then Hiranyakashipu breaks a pillar, and there comes the Narasimhadev, the transcendental, ferocious personality, Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Prahlada Halada Dhaini. So he is giving the transcendental bliss to Prahlad. Hiranyakashipur Vakshaha Shilatan Khanakalaye Ito Narsimo Parato Narsimo. So this is the transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is present in the form of his energy everywhere. One of a simile that we can use to become focused, to focus our mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is The simile is, for example, if someone is getting some kind of gift from someone, when we look at the gift, we remember the person. Would it not be so? Someone has got a gift from someone, say, for example, some birthday or something, some event, and a gift has come in. We look at the gift after 1 year or 2 years or number of whatever time passes. When we look, we remember that who has given this. So it should be exactly the same. When we look at the creation is a gift of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So when we look at the creation, anywhere in the creation, wherever, whatever we are looking at, we should remember the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And when we remember the Supreme Personality of Godhead, we know that everything is coming from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So there is this one simultaneously one and different. This is Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So the energy of the Lord is one with the Lord because it is emanating from the Lord. But it is different also because it is not the Lord himself. But because it is simultaneously one, you can immediately remember that there is the Supreme Personality of Godhead here. And any living entity, so this is what it is mentioned by Krishna himself, Vidya Vinaya Sampanne Brahmane Gavi Hastini Shuni Chaiva Shvapakecha Pandita Samadarshina. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, that a real Pandit, a real learned person, he might be seeing all the different kinds of living entities. He might be seeing a learned person, a Brahmana. He might be seeing a dog eater. He might be seeing a dog. He might be seeing a cow. He might be seeing an elephant. All the different categories of living entities. But the person knows that everyone has got the same consciousness with it. And it is the presence of the consciousness which is the symptom of the spirit soul that is actually animating all the living entities. Otherwise, if that is gone, the living entity cannot do anything. It could be as huge as an elephant. If that spark goes, the elephant is dead. So this is the transcendental position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Jiva bhuta mahabaho yayadam dharete jagat. Apareyam itastu anyam vidhime prakritim param. So Krishna mentions that there is a superior energy. Who is that? The living entity. The living entity shows the symptom of consciousness. And then we know that the entity is living. Otherwise, the entity is dead. It is a dead entity. It's not a living entity. And a dead entity means it is the inferior energy of the Lord. It is a combination of the earth, water, fire, air, ether. And then the mind, intelligence, and false ego is actually, it is that covering that the living entity is taking on into the next body. And then there is this impression from the previous birth that gets accumulated continuously, constantly. And that is why it is so important that one remembers the Lord at every moment. Then there is no padam yat vipadam na tesham. Samashritaye padapallava plavam mahat padam punya yeshu murare bhavam buddhi vatsa padam param padam yat vipadam na tesham. As it is mentioned in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, when one takes 100% shelter, samyak rupena ashrita, that is hareś caraṇa āspadam. The last line in this verse, 100% shelter at the lotus feet of the Lord. Samashritaye padapallava. What is that lotus feet? It is the lotus feet which is like a ship that helps ones to cross across the ocean of birth and death. So it is called bhava sagar. Bhavam buddhi. Ambudhi and sagar. Ambudhi is ocean and sagar is also ocean. So bhavam buddhi vatsa padam. The magnitude of water which is like in an ocean becomes like that in the hoof print of a calf. And one can easily cross over that so-called ocean of birth and death. It becomes a so-called ocean of birth and death because it becomes so small. Why? Because one has totally surrendered onto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, 100%. Samyak rupena ashrita. Samashritaye padapallava mahat padam punya yasho murare. And this is the enemy of demon Mura. And when one is engaged in remembering, chanting, or hearing about the Lord, punya shravana kirtana. By itself, it is a very pious activity. Piety is just the beginning. It transcends the pietyness. It just so yesham tu antagatam papam jananam punya karmanam te dvandva moha vinirmukta bhajante mam dhradavrata. As Krishna mentions in Bhagavad Gita, there are two prerequisites for unalloyed devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Two prerequisites Krishna mentions. What is that? The first prerequisite is yesham tva antagatam papam. So once one has stopped doing sinful activities. And then what is the second one? Jananam punya karmanam. And one has started doing, engaging in pious activites. Stop doing sinful activities and started engaging in pious activities. When these two prerequisites are done, then te dvandva moha vinirmukta. Then one comes out of this duality of this material world and this attachment to the material world. One becomes detached from the duality and attachment to the material world. Dvandva moha vinirmukta. Then what happens? Bhajante mam dhradavrata. Then one engages in my unalloyed devotional service with total determination. Satatam kirtayanto mam yatantasya dhradavrata. Namasyantasya mam bhaktya nitya yukta upasate. So this is Krishna mentioned in Bhagavad Gita that one who is totally surrendered onto the Lord, they are always engaged in the loving devotional service of the Lord, in talking about the Lord, chanting about the Lord, hearing about the Lord, remembering the Lord. So the whole savai mana Krishna padaravinde vachamsi vaikunta gunanu varnane karau harer mandiram arjanadishu shrutim chakara chuta satkatode mukunda lingalaya darshane drishau. So this is mentioned about Ambarish Maharaj. So this is a transcendental position of the pure devotees of the Lord, that their mind is always, it's like the example that is given, the simile that is given is like if you are pouring the oil from one vessel to another vessel, the flow of the oil coming from one vessel to another vessel would be constant. There would be no break. So that is the ananya shintayanto mam ye jana pariyupasate tesham nityabhiyuktanam yoga kṣemam ananya cheta satatam yo mam smarati nityasha tasyaham sulabha partha nitya yuktasya yogina. As Krishna mentions, there is ananya. That is the ananya. Ye to sarvani karmani mai sanyasya matpara buddhi yogam upashritya machitta satatam bhava. So the Krishna mentions in many, many places, he says, the concept of trying to maintain the constancy of remembrance. That is the most important part in devotional service. As much as we can constantly keep that focus on remembering the Supreme Personality of Godhead, that much there is hareś caraṇa āspadam. As it is mentioned in this last line of this verse, taking shelter at the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And it is quite interesting, Srila Prabhupada actually mentions in the conclusion of the purport, he says that even the all-pervading super soul is also dependent on the supreme aspect of Bhagavan, the Personality of Godhead. So as it is mentioned in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, vadanti tat tattvavidas tattvam yadjnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti shabdyate. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead is understood in three different phases. The first phase of understanding is Brahma. That is a glaring effulgence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Then the next phase of understanding is the localized super soul, that is Paramatma. So, Paramatmeti cha apiyukto dehesmin purushak para. Upadrashta anumanta cha bharta bhokta maheshwara. So that is what is mentioned about the super soul, the Paramatma. The Paramatma is overseeing Upadrashta Anumanta. He is giving the permission. He is a maintainer. He is the Lord. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead present in the heart of all the living entities. Sarvasya chaham hridi sannivishta. And then Bhagavan. So Bhagavan is Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. So ite chamsha kalapamsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. Indrari Vyakulam Lokam Mridayanti Yuge Yuge. As it is mentioned, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is Krishna. And when one can remember that divine activities of the Lord, his birth, his unlimited transcendental activities, and mind becomes focused on the Janma Karmam Cha Me Divyam, then one can focus on this verse also. Vikramo bhūr bhuvaḥ kṣemasya śaraṇasya sarva-kāma-varasyāpi hareś caraṇa āspadam. Thus the forward steps of the Lord are the shelter for the upper, lower and heavenly planets, as well as for all that we need. His lotus feet serve as protection from all kinds of fear. So with that, I would like to conclude this discussion. I can have a look at the chat. Okay, there's Nitin saying Hare Krishna. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Namam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyata Deshatarine Sarvam Shri Krishna Arpanamastu Krishna Matarastu Hare Krishna. Thank you very much.